Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we will travel to the open seas. Before there were navigation apps and calm digital voices telling us when to turn, there were tired sailors under cold stars tracing invisible paths across the sea. We'll follow them from memory and starlight to ink-stained charts, and finally to the silent confidence of GPS and radar. Along the way, the sea stays the same, only the tools change. Close your eyes, listen to the waves in the background, and let this slow journey through time carry you toward rest. If this cozy story helps you drift off, please subscribe, tap like, and leave a gentle comment. Your support keeps the journey continues. You are standing on the deck of a wooden ship, the kind that groans softly when it leans into the wind. The boards beneath your feet are worn smooth by boots and bare soles, the grain darkened by salt and tar. Ropes coil like sleeping snakes along the rail. A lantern hangs from a hook, glass fogged with a thin crust of salt. The sea is a wide, patient presence all around you, stretching from horizon to horizon, and your task is simple and impossible at the same time. Find your way. Long before anyone had a satellite whispering down their exact position, sailors used the world itself as their map. The coastline was a long, wrinkled line to memorize, not a clean shape printed in colour. If you hugged the shore, you could watch for familiar cliffs, headlands and river mouths, that crooked pine tree leaning over a cove, that pale patch of sand, that church tower set on a hill. These were not just scenery, they were instructions. You can imagine an old sailor on this deck squinting toward land, holding all of those shapes in his head like a string of beads. First you pass the white cliff that looks like a sleeping dog, he tells the younger crew. Then you sail on until you see the crooked tower. Keep that on your left and you'll be clear of the rocks. It's less like reading a modern chart and more like hearing a favourite story again and again until you know the next part by heart. At night, the sky becomes another sort of map. The lantern on deck throws out a small golden circle, but above it, the stars are sharp and endless. Somewhere in that glittering sprawl is the North Star, steady and almost comfortingly boring, holding its place while everything else wheels slowly around it. You can picture the navigator stepping away from the clutter of rope and barrels, tilting their head back and just breathing for a moment, letting the pattern of the sky settle into their bones. Finding the North Star is like finding the "You're Here" mark on an old paper map. Once you have it, directions arrive. This way is north, that way is south, and from there you can sketch the rest. The ship's simple compass, a small box with a needle jerking due north, joins in like a loyal but slightly moody assistant. Between the fixed star and the wavering needle, the ship begins to have a sense of where it is headed, even if the sea underneath is shifting and whispering constantly. You might notice something here. There is no glowing screen, no tidy grid, just a human brain knitting together hints. A change in the colour of the water might mean shallower depths. A line of birds flying along the horizon could suggest that land is closer than it looks. The scent of mud or leaves on the wind, the shape of waves breaking against rocks, the faint smudge of light from a village. Each is another piece of information, another small reassurance that yes, the ship is on the right path. In the cramped cabin below deck, where the air smells of wood smoke, wool and damp paper, a map might be waiting. Not always, not everywhere, and certainly not as precise as the one in your phone, but a map all the same. It is not yet the hero of the story, more like a learned friend you consult when things feel uncertain. The chart, when unrolled, crackles gently. Lines cross its surface like spider silk. Compass directions, distances, a coastline drawn in a hand that had probably never seen the place exactly as it appears on the page. Up on deck, though, the map is often invisible. It lives in the mind, carried in memory, and passed from one person to another. A captain who has sailed the same waters for years might close their eyes and see the coast. Here, a bay shaped like a half moon. There, a hidden reef just under the surface, hungry for careless hulls. The ocean might look open and formless to you, but to them, it is marked with landmarks as clearly as any city street. Of course, this kind of navigation comes with a certain amount of guesswork. Sailors in many eras used what we might call dead reckoning. Start from a known place, point the ship in a chosen direction, measure how fast you're going and for how long, and then Add it all up to estimate where you probably are now. It's a bit like walking in the dark, counting your steps and hoping you didn't veer off to the side without noticing. To do this, they needed simple tools. A sandglass, turned again and again, measured the passing of time. A log line, literally a rope with knots tied at regular intervals and a piece of wood at the end, was thrown overboard to estimate the ship's speed. As the water tugged the wooden piece and the rope streamed out behind, a sailor would count the knots that slid through his fingers before the sandglass ran out. More knots in a given time meant the ship was moving faster. That's where the word knots for speed at sea comes from. A very literal handful of rope and time. You can feel that rope, maybe, rough and wet under cold hands. You can hear the soft slap of the log on the waves, the quiet numbers murmured as someone counts under their breath. On another part of the deck, someone else watches the compass, calling out small corrections as the ship's nose drifts a little left or right. None of them have a satellite to tell them if their math is perfect. They have experience, habit, and the quiet conviction that the world is, in its own way, predictable. It's far from foolproof. Currents can nudge the ship sideways without anyone feeling it. A misread compass heading, a sandglass turned a little late, a careless estimate of speed. Small errors that over days can add up to the ship being many miles from where everyone thinks it is. But the sailors who lived with this system did not walk around in a constant panic. This was their normal. Just as you trust your phone to know where you are, they trusted their tools and their routines, because trust is the only way to make a journey bearable. If you listen closely in your imagination, the ship is full of these small acts of faith. A sailor checks the stars and confirms the course. Another notes the ship's speed in a worn logbook, ink spreading slightly on the rough paper. The captain feels the wind on his cheeks, watches the way the waves strike the bow, and decides that the ship is being pushed a little offline and needs to bear more to the west. None of them could give you a grid reference, but they could tell you calmly that if you keep this heading until dawn, a certain point of land should appear off the port bow. And when that headland does appear, faint at first, then clearer as the light grows, it is a quiet victory, a proof that their invisible lines in the air match the actual shape of the world. You might celebrate in the way you do when your navigation app actually takes you to the right cafe on the first try. They simply nod, share a small smile, and get back to work. From where you sit now, perhaps in bed with your phone charging nearby, this might feel impossibly fragile. Why trust the angle of a star or the swing of a needle, when you could have something as concrete as a digital map? But for centuries, concrete at sea looked different. It meant stars that came back every clear night, winds that followed seasonal patterns, currents that flowed in reliable directions, and coastlines that stayed mostly where they were expected to be. If you think of all this as a kind of slow-breathing navigation system, you won't be far off. Instead of signals pinging between satellites and receivers, there are signals passing between the sky and the sea and the minds of the people on board. A sailor glances at the horizon, adjusting the mental picture of the ship's path. Someone leans over the side at night and sees the dim line where darker water meets lighter water, suggesting a change in depth. These are updates in their internal app, delivered quietly with no loading screen. Every now and then, you might imagine one of these early navigators transported into a modern ship's bridge. They would see screens glowing with exact positions, lines marking traffic, charts that show every bump and twist of the coast. They might be awed, skeptical, or both. It would certainly feel like cheating, a bit like being given all the answers at the back of the textbook. But they would also recognise something familiar. The steady hum of the ship, the low murmur of voices, the careful attention to direction and speed. Underneath the electronics, the old question is exactly the same as it was on that wooden deck. Where are we now, and where are we going? For tonight, though, we stay with the earlier scene. The lantern still sways on its hook, painting slow arcs of light across the planks. The air is cool and damp, tasting faintly of salt and smoke. Above, the stars watch with their old, patient faces. The ship moves forward, not with pinpoint precision, but with enough understanding to keep fear at bay. Somewhere, a sailor closes the cabin door on the crackling map, trusting the remembered shapes of shore and sky. The rope is coiled, the compass is settled, the sandglass has been turned one more time. Out here, before screens and satellites, the world itself is the map, and finding the way is a quiet conversation between wood, water, wind, and the humans who dare to drift among them. And as you lie there listening, perhaps with your own sense of direction gently dissolving into drowsiness, you can feel a small kinship with everyone who has ever looked up at the night and wondered, where am I exactly? Their tools were different, rougher and slower, but the wish is the same. And in that shared, simple wish, the sea feels just a little smaller, and the night a little kinder. Picture yourself ducking through a low doorway into the ship's cabin. The air is warmer in here, heavy with the smell of smoke, wool, damp wood, and something faintly sour that might be old stew or just the general aroma of people living close together. The ship's motion is more noticeable in this confined space. The floor rises and falls in a slow, inevitable rhythm. Over a small table, an oil lamp swings on a hook, its light moving across the walls in gentle arcs, as if the cabin itself is breathing. On the table lies a chart. It is not the crisp, folded thing you might buy in a modern sailing shop, or the bright rectangle that appears on your phone. The paper might not even be paper as you know it, but parchment, scraped smooth from animal skin, or rough fibrous sheets that were never intended to be perfectly flat. The surface is slightly uneven, textured under your fingertips. When the navigator unrolls it, it crackles softly, like a quiet fire, as if it remembers every journey it has already taken. The coastline on this chart is not a perfect match to reality. It is a suggestion, a careful guess improved bit by bit. Bays curl inward in long lazy arcs. Capes and headlands jut out like crooked fingers. There are small symbols for ports, tiny clusters of dots for shoals, maybe a little drawing where someone thought a lighthouse or a church tower was important enough to deserve a picture. At the edges, the ink fades where fingers have brushed it too many times. In some corners, the faint ghost of older lines shows where someone corrected the shape of a coast or added a newly discovered inlet. For the people who made these maps, the world did not arrive as a satellite image. It arrived one shoreline at a time, one risky approach in fog, one half-terrified survey of rocks barely clearing the hull. Every line on the chart is the result of someone watching very, very carefully, and then living long enough to tell someone else about it. You can imagine an early chart maker, perhaps standing in a harbour town, perhaps hunched at a table like this one, listening to a procession of weathered sailors, each offering their version of a coast. One remembers a reef that lies just 2 ship lengths off the headland. Another recalls a current that pulls you sideways if you steer straight for a certain cove. All of that experience settles into ink. On board, the navigator treats the chart with a kind of practiced tenderness. They know it is both vital and imperfect, wise and a little wrong. The lamp's light pools over the middle of the sheet, leaving the corners to fade into shadow. A pair of dividers, those 2-pointed, slightly menacing compass-like tools, rests on one edge. There might be a simple ruler with darkened edges from years of handling. There is certainly a logbook nearby, its pages filled with neat lines of numbers and notes, bearings, beads, scraps of weather, small remarks like lights of town visible to east or uncharted shoals suspected. The navigator leans over, planting a hand on either side of the chart as the ship shifts. They steady themselves without thinking. This is second nature. They find the last mark they made, a tiny cross or circle where they believed the ship to be the night before. From there, using the remembered direction and distance travelled, they walk the dividers along the lines on the chart, clicking them gently across the surface, marking where the ship should be now. It's a bit like watching someone move a game piece across a board, except the stakes are higher than just losing a turn. Outside, the sea does not know or care that it has been drawn. Waves do what they've always done. Currents keep their own quiet schedules, but here, in the glow of the lamp, the map becomes a kind of conversation partner. The navigator checks the compass heading and matches it to the compass rose printed on the chart. They measure from their current estimate to the next desired headland, counting out distance along the inked scale, then convert that distance back into time and speed. The chart gently dictates the story. If we hold this course for this long, we should see a certain island off the starboard bow at dawn. Maps at sea were never just pretty pictures. They were promises. A merchant ship loaded with cloth and spices and hopes would trust that a few lines and symbols stood between prosperous arrival and very unprofitable shipwreck. A navy relied on charts to manoeuvre safely through unfamiliar waters, to know where friendly ports waited, and where dangerous shoals lurked. Even the smallest fishing vessel might carry a rough sketch or the mental echo of a chart, knowing that certain banks and ridges beneath the waves were more generous with their catch than others. You can almost hear the way sailors might speak about a good chart. Not with reverent poetry, perhaps, but with genuine affection. "She's an old one, but she's never yet lied," someone might say, smoothing a wrinkled corner. Another sailor, less sentimental, could mutter that he trusts the sky in his own eyes more than any scrap of parchment. Still, when the weather turns uncertain, when the horizon disappears into a blur of mist, everyone ends up glancing toward the cabin where that chart waits, as if expecting it to offer reassurance. Of course, early charts had their quirks. Some might show sea monsters curling politely in unexplored corners, not because cartographers truly believed a specific dragon lived there, but as a general way of saying, "We have no idea what's out in this direction yet. Please be careful." Entire coastlines could be shifted, shrunk or stretched. A bay might be placed too far north, an island drawn larger than it deserved. From your modern point of view, used to zooming into a photograph of Earth, these distortions look endearingly clumsy, as if a child had been asked to draw the world from memory. But if you lean closer, you begin to see the skill. Many charts, especially those used in active sea trade, were the result of constant revision. Captains who trusted a chart might add their own corrections with a sharp quill, changing the position of a reef slightly, or noting that safe anchorage lies farther east than drawn. Sometimes a chart would pass through many hands over decades, gaining small scars and improvements until it was less a single person's work and more a community project in paper form. Imagine for a moment the emotional weight of that. When you open your map app and see a perfect coastline, you rarely think about who made it. A corporation, a satellite, some invisible army of data. But in this cabin, the person tracing a line along the coast might know who first drew it. They might recall the story of the storm in which a previous captain narrowly avoided the rocks that aren't on older charts. There is history in every stroke of ink, stories behind every little symbol. As the ship sails on, the chart becomes a kind of quiet diary. Each new note or tiny mark adds another layer of conversation between the vessel and the sea. A new harbour explored, marked. A sandbar discovered where none was expected. Circled, maybe underlined with a slightly irritated flourish. Even the wrinkles and water stains tell tales of hurried consultations in bad weather, where the map was snatched up by wet hands and studied under a flickering lamp while the ship lurched. Now and then the navigator steps outside the cabin, blinking into the brighter light, chart images still ghosting behind their eyes. They look at the actual horizon, at the real waves and clouds, and try to fit them to what the ink suggests. There is an art to this matching, a gentle back and forth between trusting the chart and trusting the present moment. A familiar headland glimpsed through haze can feel like a friend appearing in a crowded room. A missing landmark, one that should be visible by now according to the map, can send a quiet chill through the stomach. When the two agree, the world and the chart, reality and ink, there is a satisfying click, almost audible, like two pieces of a puzzle settling into place. The navigator marks the logbook with a firm stroke. The captain relaxes slightly, perhaps even allows a joke about not needing to sleep in the chart room tonight. For a while, everything lines up. It's when the chart and the world disagree that things become complicated. Perhaps a hidden current has been nudging the ship sideways, so the estimated position is off. Perhaps the chart is old and missing information discovered since it was made. In those moments, the map reveals its limits. It is only a model, an attempt, a human guess pressed into lines. The navigator must once again reach for the tools of part one: the stars, the wind, the colour of the water, the direction of the swell. The chart is important, but it is not a tyrant. It is one voice in a chorus. Over time, as more ships travel more routes, charts are redrawn. New editions replace old ones. The lamp in this cabin might one day shine on a different sheet, with cleaner coastlines and more precise markings. The navigator might keep the older chart rolled up in a corner, reluctant to discard it because it has earned its keep. In a way, these maps are like family photo albums. Outdated, sure, but full of memories and moments when they mattered dearly. From where you lie now, maybe under a soft blanket with your own room swaying only in your imagination, you could think of these charts as the early ancestors of every map you've ever used. the road atlases your parents kept in the glove compartment, the subway diagrams you've stared at on tiled walls, the glowing navigation apps that guide you through unfamiliar streets while you half listen and half daydream. All of them are doing what this fragile sheet in the cabin is trying its best to do. Turn the messy, three-dimensional, often moody world into something you can see, understand, and trust enough to move through. As the oil in the lamp burns lower, the navigator makes one last mark for the night. The ship's position is estimated, the next heading noted, the chart carefully re-rolled and tied with a length of cord. The cabin grows dimmer, the corners fading into shadow. Outside, the sea continues its unbothered murmuring around the hull. You can imagine the navigator pausing for a moment, resting a hand on the rolled chart as if it were a sleeping creature. For all its flaws, it has carried them this far. It has turned stories and sightings and careful measurements into something solid enough to trust. In the morning, they will unroll it again, smooth it out, and ask it the old questions. Where are we, and how far do we have to go? And as you drift towards sleep, you might feel a quiet reassurance in that image. A single, flickering lamp, a creaking wooden table, and a map that is never perfect but always trying to be a little bit truer than the last one. The ship moves on through the dark, guided not only by stars and instinct, but by lines laid down by many hands, many journeys ago. The world has been folded up for a moment, just long enough for someone to trace a path across it, before it is once more rolled away and the sea takes over the story again. By now, in your mind, you've stepped into the little cabin with the swinging lamp, watched the navigator coax meaning out of lines and ink, and listen to the quiet confidence of people who trust the stars. It all feels almost comfortable, as if finding your way at sea is mostly a matter of good tools and steady nerves. But the sea, generous as it can be, still has a habit of raising a slow, salty eyebrow and asking, "Are you sure?" To feel that question properly, you have to go a little farther from land. Imagine the ship pushing steadily out into open water. The last smudge of coastline has faded behind you, leaving nothing but a ring of horizon. The deck feels a little emptier, without the reassuring shape of hills and headlands to measure against. The planks under your feet still rise and fall with the same rhythm. The rigging still hums softly in the wind, but the world has simplified into three things: wood, water, and sky. It's beautiful in the way a blank page is beautiful, and just as capable of making you nervous. Here, beyond the line of sight of land, the old skills stretch to cover much more space. Dead reckoning becomes the ship's inner voice. Every hour, someone notes the heading and the speed in the logbook, running fingers over the cramped little entries, wind direction, sail changes, maybe a brief comment on the quality of last night's stew. The navigator uses these fragments to imagine the ship's invisible trail across the surface of the sea, a path no one can actually see, yet everyone must believe in. The tools are simple, almost comfortingly so. The logline still splashes into the wake with its familiar sound, ropes sliding through calloused hands as knots are counted. The sandglass continues its quiet, reliable work, grains falling at the same lazy pace they always have. The compass card wobbles and rights itself, pointing north with that slightly fussy insistence you might recognise from someone who is always right and a little smug about it. Taken together, these things let the navigator say, "We've gone about this far in roughly this direction, for this amount of time, but the sea is not a road. There are no painted lines, no signposts. Beneath the hull, currents move like slow rivers inside the larger ocean, nudging the ship a few degrees off course here, a little more there. A northbound current might carry you farther than you think, another might gently, persistently tug you sideways. On deck, you don't feel that sideways drift. The boards simply rise and fall, as always. It's like walking on one of those moving airport walkways without realising it, except the walkway has no edges and no obvious start or finish. Sailors learned to respect these invisible hands. They noticed that in certain regions the water changed colour, grew warmer or cooler, or carried bits of seaweed from faraway coasts. They felt different swells crossing under the ship from odd angles, a kind of crossing heartbeat at the hull. They learned slowly that these signs meant the currents were at work. Charts began to carry not just lines of coast, but small arrows and notes about waters that could hurry you along or quietly undo hours of careful navigation. And then there is the sky. So far it has been a friendly partner. Clear nights, steady stars, a horizon you can count on. But out in the open, weather has room to stretch. Clouds gather, not in dramatic storybook storms at first, but as a thick grey lid that simply refuses to move. Night comes, and instead of sharp pinpricks of light, there is only a soft, uniform darkness. The horizon disappears, melted into the sky. The navigator steps out on the deck, sextant in hand. A sturdy angular instrument with cool metal edges and small mirrors carefully adjusted. It is ready to measure the angle of a star above the horizon, ready to turn the sky into a kind of ruler. But tonight, there is nothing to measure. No visible border between sea and sky, no star bright enough to pierce the cloud. The sextant hangs unused at the navigator's side, a little like a calculator with no numbers to work on. One cloudy night isn't so bad. The ship keeps to its course, the logbook entries continue, and everyone trusts that the weather will clear. 2 cloudy nights test patience. By the third, people start to watch the navigators face the way passengers now secretly watch a pilot's expression. No one says it out loud, but the question is there. Do you still know where we are? The answer, if they're honest, is probably. Dead reckoning has been ticking along steadily. The chart has a neat little line drawn for the expected path and a small mark for the ship's current estimated position. But without stars or sun to check that position, uncertainty creeps in around the edges. A slightly misread compass bearing here, a moment of inattention during a speed check there, a current that chose today to be a little stronger than usual. Each small, harmless error can quietly fold itself into the journey. Over hundreds of miles, harmless becomes noticeable. Still, the ship carries on because there is nothing else to do. Sails strain gently against their ropes. The timbers creak with a familiar, almost reassuring complaint. Below deck, people sleep in narrow hammocks that sway with every movement, wrapped in scratchy blankets that smell faintly of salt and wool. They trust, in a half-dreaming way, that the people awake above them know what they're doing. When fog joins the story, things become stranger. Near coasts, especially in certain seasons, a soft, dense mist can tumble and roll in and stay, muffling sound and erasing distance. Up on deck, visibility might shrink to a few ship lengths. The sea turns into a muted grey room, where everything feels close but nothing can be seen. Footsteps sound louder. Voices drop as if everyone has stumbled into a quiet chapel. Here, coastal navigation becomes something like echolocation for humans. Sailors listen. They strain for the distant boom of surf on rocks, for the hollow clap of waves against cliffs, for the faint clang of a bellbuoy, or the deep tone of a foghorn in later centuries. They smell, too. The damp, earthy scent that drifts from land. The sharper tang of seaweed. Even the faint smoke of fires burning in villages. The map in the cabin might show that the ship is approaching a headland, but it is the low, rhythmic roar of unseen breakers that makes the danger feel real. To help resolve that uncertainty, there is another simple, tactile tool, the lead line. Picture a sturdy rope coiled neatly on the deck with a heavy lump of lead or another weight at its end. A sailor swings it out and drops it overboard, letting it plummet straight down until it thuds softly against the seabed. Marks along the rope show the depth. Sometimes the underside of the lead is smeared with tallow, a sticky fat that brings up a small sample of whatever lies below, sand, mud, shell fragments. Depth and bottom typed together form another kind of map, one that lives in memory and logbooks. Firm sand at 12 fathoms means we're likely here. Sticky mud at 6 means we're probably too close to shore. You can almost feel the weight of the line in your own hands, the way it pulls as the ship moves, the damp chill of the rope as it slides back on deck. Each sounding as a small act of reassurance. Yes, the depth roughly matches what the chart promises. Or, less comfortably, no, it does not. And then, of course, there are storms. We can leave out the worst of them for tonight. No need to call up images of splintered masts and dramatic rescues when you're trying to fall asleep. Instead, picture a more modest, everyday kind of bad weather. Strong wind, high waves, rain that stings your face. The ship heeling over but still under control. In such conditions, navigation becomes less about refinement and more about broad strokes. The priority shifts to keeping the ship safe, sails reduced, course adjusted to meet the waves at a survivable angle. When the worst passes, the sea remains unsettled. The sky clears unevenly, clouds racing between patches of blue. The navigator finally seizes a chance, a glimpse of sun at noon, a star at dawn, anything to measure. That first clear reading after days of uncertainty is a tense moment. The sextant's metal feels extra cold in the hand. The scribbled calculations in the notebook are double-checked, then checked again. If the result says, "You are roughly where you thought you were," there is a quiet, deep relief. Not the cheering kind, just a loosening of shoulders, a slightly lighter step. If it says, "You're not where you thought you were," there is a pause, maybe a soft sigh, and then work. Lines on the chart must be redrawn. The ship's intended track shifts accordingly. The captain and navigator talk in low voices, heads bent close over the table, while outside life on deck goes on, the barrels still creak, the chickens in their coop still cluck at inconvenient moments, and someone still manages to spill something in the galley. The challenges are not only physical but human. Long voyages mean tired eyes and tired tempers. Two people might remember a headland differently. One might be more optimistic about their current position, another might be more cautious, suggesting that they are farther from safety than anyone would like. On some ships, disagreements over navigation could become serious matters, but here in our bedtime version, let's imagine them as muted, thoughtful debates, more like puzzled friends arguing over a slightly blurry photograph than rivals shouting over a map. In the middle of all this, the map's significance becomes clearer. It is no longer just a helpful tool, it is the fragile bridge between what the crew can sense and what they can't. The chart cannot calm the waves, but it can give the ship a path to follow when the horizon has vanished and the stars have gone to hide. The navigator's log, with its steady march of numbers and notes, becomes a sort of heartbeat, proof that time is passing and the ship is, at least, moving. If you compare all this to the way you travel now, it might feel exhausting. Imagine your navigation app working only when the sky's clear, losing signal in every cloud, requiring you to manually enter your walking speed and direction every hour. Imagine trying to find a city using faint sounds, changes in the smell of the air, and how tired your legs feel. And yet for centuries this is exactly what people did, calmly, routinely, night after night. The miracle is not that they sometimes got lost, the miracle is how often they didn't. In the end, most voyages reached their destinations, ships appeared where charts said they ought to appear, sliding into harbours that matched the ink drawings well enough. The fact that uncertainty was always lurking at the edge of the map did not stop people from trusting it. They accepted that their knowledge of the sea would never be perfect, but could be good enough, and being good enough combined with patience and a bit of luck was usually all that was required. As you lie there now, you might recognise a faint echo of that feeling. Perhaps you too have gone through days when the sky felt cloudy and your internal compass a bit unreliable. You kept moving anyway, trusting routine, small measurements, and the hope that clarity would return. Sailors centuries ago were doing something very similar, just with more salt and fewer coffee breaks. So the ship in our story sails on, through fog and clouds and stretches of open water where nothing looks different from the day before. The logline still splashes, the lead line still thuds softly on the seabed, the chart still gathers its little pencil marks. Above, at last, the clouds begin to thin. A star appears, shy at first, then joined by others. The horizon sharpens. Somewhere on the edge of sight, the faintest outline of land waits to be recognised. The navigator, who has been quietly collecting questions from the sea, "Where are you really? How sure are you?" finally has a chance to answer. The sextant is lifted, the angle is taken, the numbers settle into place. The chart receives a new, firmer mark, and the ship, which has never stopped moving forward, simply continues on, adjusting its course by a few careful degrees. In that small adjustment, all the challenges of the voyage are gathered up and softened. Uncertainty, clouds, currents, fatigue, they've all had their turn. And still here the ship is, not perfectly placed perhaps, but close enough to carry its people safely onward. You too are still moving, even if only in imagination, as your thoughts drift, like low clouds over a dark sea. The questions that seemed sharp at the start of the night are already a little blurrier at the edges. The waves have become a slow, repetitive hush. Somewhere between your pillow and the imagined deck of that ship, you begin to understand the quiet courage of navigating in a world where the way forward is always known just enough. By now you've stood on the deck of a wooden ship, felt the rough rope against your palms, watched a lantern sway over a crackling chart, and listened to sailors ask the sea careful questions. For this last part, we're going to step forward in time, gently, onto a different deck. The wood has largely given way to steel, the sails have become engines, and the lantern has turned into a collection of glowing screens. The core question, though, hasn't changed at all. You still have people afloat on water wanting to know, where are we, and how do we get safely where we're going? The tools have changed, the wish has not. Imagine yourself on the bridge of a modern ship at night. Not a huge, roaring cruise liner, too many buffets for a sleepy story, but a working vessel, maybe a research ship, maybe a cargo carrier carrying containers stacked like neat building blocks. The bridge is high above the water, with wide windows stretching from side to side. Outside, the sea is a dim, restless presence, black with a faint silver sheen where the moon catches waves. Inside, the light is low. The brightest things in the room are not lanterns, but screens. There is a main console, like a broad desk, with displays set into it, digital charts, radar screens, instruments ticking numbers steadily upward and downward. Small indicator lights glow like patient, colourful stars, each representing some piece of machinery quietly doing its job. The air hums with a soft chorus of electronics and ventilation, a far cry from the crackle of oil lamps and the creak of wooden beams, but still, underneath you can feel the same deliberate calm. On one screen is the modern version of the old parchment chart. The coastline is drawn with sharp accuracy, every bay and inlet shown in detail. There are symbols for buoys, depth contours in fine concentric lines, and notes about harbours and anchorages. You can zoom in and out with a few nudges of a trackball, or a swipe on a touch panel. It's a kind of magic trick. The world shrinking and expanding like a living thing under your fingertips. On this chart, a small ship icon shows where you are. Not where you think you are, but where a network of satellites, far above the atmosphere, believes you to be. Global navigation satellite systems, GPS and its siblings, send down constant invisible signals. Receivers on the ship listen, compare tiny differences in timing, and calculate the vessel's position with an accuracy that would make a 17th century navigator put down his sextant and say, "All right, that's cheating." The old tasks are still being done, just hidden under the hood. Instead of sailors throwing log lines and counting knots, the ship has sensors that measure speed through the water and over the ground. Instead of turning sandglasses, computers track time to absurd precision. Instead of a navigator hunched over a chart with dividers, software continuously updates the ship's position and draws its trail as a neat line across the digital sea. Another screen shows radar, circles expanding outward from the ship's position, with small blips marking other vessels, coastlines and larger obstacles. It's as if the ship has developed a new sense, able to feel nearby objects in the dark or fog, long before human eyes could spot them. Where earlier sailors strained their ears for the sound of surf or a bell in the mist, the radar quietly, unemotionally tells you, there is something solid over there at this bearing and distance. Yet another display shows the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, a kind of polite gossip network for ships. Vessels broadcast their position, course, speed, and name over radio, and those signals appear on the screen as tiny icons. The officer on watch can see not only that there is another ship on the horizon, but also what it's called, how fast it's moving and where it intends to go. It's like sailing through the dark while also being in a group chat where everyone has location sharing turned on. If you glance around the bridge, you'll see other smaller nods to the past. There is still a compass, though it may be a digital display, the heading repeated on several screens. There is often a paper chart or two carefully stored, just in case the electronics fail. Some ships still train their officers to take sextant sights, if only to remember that the sky above them is still perfectly capable of giving directions, even if the screens go black. The wisdom of older centuries lingers like a second language, not always spoken but comforting to know. The officer of the watch walks slowly from one side of the bridge to the other, glancing out at the dark and then back at the instruments. They check that the ship is following its planned route, a series of waypoints laid out in advance on the chart, like stepping stones across the sea. Those waypoints might have been chosen for practical reasons: depth, traffic separation schemes, shipping lanes. but to you watching, they simply look like a dotted line across the glowing screen. A path traced just as surely as any ink track on old parchment. If something needs adjusting, they might nudge the autopilot. Yes, many ships now steer themselves much of the time, following headings or tracks more steadily than any human could manage hour after hour. But the autopilot is no captain. It's more like a very patient helmsman who needs to be told exactly what to do. Humans still decide where the ship should go and what it should avoid. They still peer into the dark, decide how to meet an approaching storm, or how to pass a fishing fleet with respect and safety. The challenges of modern navigation are subtler than the crashing drama you might expect. Obviously, storms still exist, and you probably don't want to meet one in a small boat if you can help it. But much of the difficulty now lives in planning and attention rather than raw survival. There is traffic to avoid, environmental zones to respect, narrow channels to transit with just enough water under the keel. The sea has not become tame, it has simply become better understood, parcelled into zones and lanes the way roads carve up a landscape. With all this technology, it might seem like people at sea no longer need to think about where they are, but in a way they think about it more. There are more numbers to watch, more data to integrate. GPS positions, radar echoes, AIS targets, weather forecasts streaming in via satellite, even high-resolution images of currents and waves. The Navigator's mental map is now a layered, multicoloured thing. Part memory, part training, part live feed of information. And yet, if you peel all that away, the continuity is obvious. Picture a moment when the ship rounds a headland it has been steering toward for hours. On the screen, the little icon moves past a digital point of land. Outside the window, an actual headland rises in the dark, perhaps only visible as a blacker shape against the night sky, perhaps picked out in the scattered lights of a town. Someone on the bridge glances from the real thing to the chart, checks that the two images agree, and feels that same quiet click of satisfaction an old navigator felt when an inked drawing of a bay matched the coastline in front of them. The tools have been upgraded. The feeling is exactly the same. The sea still asks its questions, though they sound slightly different now. Instead of, "Can you hold a course when the stars are hidden?" it might ask, "Will you still know what to do if the signal disappears?" Instead of, "Can you hear the breakers in the fog?" it might ask, "Are you still looking out the window, or are you staring only at the screens?" Navigators answer by blending both worlds, using the power of satellite and sensor, but also keeping that old habit of simply looking, listening and noticing. Back in your own life, finding your way has begun to feel a little similar. Your phone pings and nudges you with directions as you walk through a city. Maps spin under your fingertips. Blue dots glide along routes. Sometimes you let the device lead completely, sometimes you look up at the actual street signs, the tilt of the hill, the line of trees, and say, "No, actually I think it's this way." Technology provides, but your senses and instincts never quite retire. On modern ships, just as on those older ones, there are moments of stillness. Imagine dawn on that bridge. The sky lightens in slow bands, navy to grey to the first weak hints of colour. Night mode on the screens keeps things dim. Red lights may glow softly to protect night vision. Outside, the horizon emerges, a clean line instead of a mystery. Someone brings a mug of coffee to the officer on watch, placing it carefully to avoid the nearest set of buttons. The officer takes a sip, glances at the GPS position, then out at the growing light. A distant lighthouse flashes at its appointed interval, a rhythm set long before satellites, now faithfully recorded in digital lists. Characteristic, full 10 seconds, or something similar. The light reaches across the water in pulses, a human-made star with a schedule. Once, that flash was a lifeline, the difference between a safe landfall and a disastrous approach. It still matters, but now it is one more data point in a sea of data, one more friendly confirmation that the ship is where it thinks it is. You can watch them smile slightly at the sight of it, this quiet, old-fashioned beacon still working. For a moment, the bridge holds both eras in its dim air. The ancient comfort of a lighthouse and the modern certainty of satellite navigation, sharing the same dawn. And somewhere far away you, in a bed on dry land, might glance at the glow of your own screen. Your biggest navigation crisis tonight might be realising you left your phone on the other side of the room after already getting comfortable under the covers. The stakes are thankfully much lower, but the basic trust is similar. You expect your maps to know where you are. You expect the blue dot to track your path faithfully when you need it again in the morning. If you turn the screen off now, your room will go dark in the familiar way. But above your ceiling, beyond the roof, the same stars that once guided the wooden ships are still there, whether anyone looks at them or not. They don't mind that you prefer GPS. They've been patient for a very long time. Somewhere at sea, a navigator might even be using them as a backup tonight, or simply as a quiet reminder that the universe has its own dependable patterns. So the story comes full circle. Once, people stood on decks with little more than a compass, a chart, and their own sense of the world to guide them. They listened to waves, watched birds, smelled land on the wind, and read the sky like a familiar book. Later, they added better charts, more precise instruments, radio signals, radar. And now they carry the world in small receivers that listen to satellites and draw tiny icons on glowing maps, giving answers so quickly that the old anxieties barely have time to form. But underneath, nothing essential has changed. A ship is still a place where humans move over something larger than themselves. Someone still stands watching the dark while others sleep. Decisions are still made about which course to steer, which hazards to skirt, which path through the water is safest and kindest to those on board. The sea still rolls, indifferent and beautiful, under hulls of wood or steel. As you drift towards sleep, you might feel a little kinship with all of them. The early navigator squinting at a star, the chartmaker tracing a new bay, the officer on the modern bridge glancing between screen and horizon, and even your own sleepy self, occasionally asking a glowing map, "Where am I? How do I get home?" The answers come faster now, singing down from orbiting machines instead of humming up from a compass needle. Yet home is still home, safe harbour is still safe harbour, and the route between them is still a line you trace one way or another across the great shifting surface of the world. Tonight you don't have to trace anything. The only voyage you need to manage is the small private one from waking to sleep. You've walked the old decks and stood on the modern bridge. You've watched lanterns and screens glow, heard waves against wood and metal, felt the gentle worry and the quiet relief of knowing roughly where you are. Now, you can let the maps close. Let the charts, paper, parchment or digital, roll themselves back up in your imagination. Let the ship, whichever era it lives in, continue smoothly on its way without you for a while. The stars can keep watch, the satellites can whisper positions to whoever needs them. You, for this stretch of the night, are already where you need to be. And so, our journey for tonight comes to a quiet close. The story lingers, like the last glow of candlelight, as you drift further into rest. If these gentle wanderings bring you peace, I invite you to like and subscribe so that whenever you wish, you may return and we can travel together once more. For now, dear listener, may your dreams be kind and your night be restful. Until next time.